The streets of Manhattan were soaked with the relentless drizzle of an October afternoon. Pedestrians clutched umbrellas, their faces obscured by the haze of rain and hurry. James Whitmore, dressed in his tailored trench coat and leather gloves, navigated the wet pavement with the calculated precision of a man accustomed to control. At 58, he was a picture of polished success. Silver-streaked hair, a strong jawline that carried the weight of his determination, and the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered the art of achieving without attachments. But beneath the facade, James carried a void, a hollow carved by years of emotional isolation and the haunting loss of his late wife, Eleanor. He hated walking, yet here he was, stepping out of his chauffeured car 2 blocks early after a heated boardroom meeting, seeking solace in the rhythm of his steps. As he approached the corner of Lexington Avenue, something made him pause. Under the awning of a closed bakery sat a young woman, her shoulders hunched against the rain. Her auburn hair clung to her face, soaked through, and her trembling hands cradled 2 small infants swaddled in tattered blankets. She wasn't begging. She wasn't speaking. She simply sat there, tears streaming silently down her face, staring into the distance as if hope itself had abandoned her. James hesitated. He rarely engaged with strangers, especially those who looked like they might ask for something he couldn't give. But something about her, perhaps the haunting vulnerability in her eyes or the quiet resilience in how she held those children, compelled him to stop. "Miss," he said, his deep voice softened by uncharacteristic concern, "are you all right?" The woman startled, her arms instinctively tightening around the babies. I'm fine," she stammered, though her cracked voice and trembling lips betrayed her words. "You're not fine," James replied, his tone firm but not unkind. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "What are you doing out here in this weather with 2 infants? Do you have somewhere to go?" The woman shook her head, tears spilling faster now. I had to leave. We had nowhere else." James frowned, his heart tightening in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Leave where? Are you in danger?" The young mother hesitated before nodding. "My husband. He's not a good man. We had to get away." James inhaled sharply, his instincts urging him to walk away from the complexity of her situation. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp white handkerchief. "Here," he offered. "Wipe your face." She stared at him, wary but desperate, before taking the cloth with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rain. James straightened and pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call my driver. You and the babies can't stay out here." "No," she exclaimed suddenly, her panic flaring. "Please. No police, no one who might trace me back to him." James raised a placating hand. "I'm not calling the police. Just my car. You'll come somewhere safe and we'll figure this out." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the tiny faces nestled against her chest. Finally, she nodded, exhaustion and desperation overtaking her mistrust. Within minutes, James's sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver, an older man named Walter who had been with James for decades, stepped out to open the door. Walter's brow furrowed at the sight of the soaked woman and her children, but said nothing as James helped her into the car. The warmth of the car enveloped them, and the young mother visibly relaxed, though her eyes never left her babies. One of them stirred, a soft whimper escaping his lips. She instinctively rocked him, whispering soothing words that James couldn't make out. "Do they have names?" James asked after a moment, breaking the silence. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "The boy is Noah. The girl is Lily. Beautiful names," he said, offering a small smile. "And you? What's your name?" "Claire," she replied quietly, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Well, Claire, let's get you and the little ones somewhere warm and dry. We'll figure out the rest later." They arrived at the Whitmore, a luxury hotel James owned in Midtown. He directed the staff with his usual commanding presence, ensuring Claire and the babies were brought to a private suite without question. Claire looked around the room, wide-eyed at its opulence, but her exhaustion overtook her curiosity. "Take a moment to settle," James said gently. "Order food if you need it." Rest. We'll talk in the morning. Claire hesitated before nodding. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As James left the room, he felt something stir within him. He had stepped in out of a sense of duty, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter held a deeper significance, one he didn't yet understand. As James walked away from the suite, his thoughts swirled. Claire's desperation, her trembling voice, the tiny faces of the babies. All of it gnawed at a part of him he had long ignored. He had always considered himself a man of action, someone who fixed problems with efficiency and logic. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt something more. A need to protect, to care. It wasn't just pity. It was something deeper, more personal, though he couldn't quite place why. The next morning, James woke early, unable to shake his restlessness. He found himself pacing the long marble hallways of the hotel, his thoughts drifting back to Claire and the children. It wasn't his responsibility, he reminded himself. He could easily write a check, ensure they were safe, and move on. But the image of Claire's haunted eyes wouldn't let him settle. There was something about her, something that pulled at him in a way he hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death. Finally, he decided to check on her. He instructed the hotel staff to deliver a modest breakfast to the suite before making his way there. As he knocked lightly on the door, it opened a crack, and Claire peeked out. Her face was still pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was a trace of relief when she saw him. "Good morning," he said softly. "I hope I didn't wake you." She shook her head and opened the door further. "No, I've been up for a while." Inside, the suite was quiet. One of the babies, Noah, lay in a makeshift crib fashioned from a hotel bassinet. Lily was cradled in Claire's arms, her tiny fist curled against her mother's chest. Claire gestured to the small table where the breakfast tray sat untouched. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped yesterday." James stepped inside, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm glad I could help. Have you eaten?" Claire glanced at the tray, then back at him, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face. "I wasn't sure if it was really for me." James frowned slightly, the thought of her questioning something as basic as food striking a nerve. "Of course it's for you. And the babies. Please, sit. Eat." She hesitated but eventually placed Lily in the bassinet beside Noah and sat at the table. James took the chair opposite her, watching as she nibbled cautiously at a slice of toast. The silence between them stretched, though it didn't feel uncomfortable. Instead, it was laden with unspoken questions. "Claire," James began after a moment, his tone gentle but firm, "I want to help you, but I need to understand more about your situation. You mentioned your husband. Is he looking for you?" Her hand froze midair, the piece of toast trembling slightly. She lowered it back to the plate and nodded. "He doesn't like to lose control," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I was the one thing he thought he had total control over." James's jaw tightened. He wasn't a stranger to the destructive nature of control. His own father had been a master of it, dictating every aspect of James's life until the day he'd been old enough to break free. The thought of someone using that power to harm Claire filled him with a quiet rage. "You're safe here," he assured her. "No one will find you. And if they try, they'll have to go through me." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, her tough exterior cracked. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice tinged with both gratitude and suspicion. "You don't even know me." James leaned back in his chair, considering her question. The truth was, he didn't fully understand his own motivations. He could say it was out of kindness, a desire to do the right thing, but deep down, he sensed there was something more. Something about Claire resonated with him, as if her pain echoed his own. "Let's just say I've been where you are," he finally said. "Not in the same way, but I know what it's like to feel trapped, like you've lost control of your own life. And I know what it's like to have someone give you a second chance." She studied him for a long moment, her guarded expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me. Most people wouldn't." James nodded, not trusting himself to say more. For now, it was enough that she felt safe. As the days passed, Claire and the babies began to settle into a routine. James made sure they had everything they needed: clothes, diapers, formula, and arranged for a doctor to check on the children. He visited them daily, finding himself drawn to their small, quiet world. Noah and Lily were bright, curious babies, their tiny giggles and coos a stark contrast to the weight of their mother's struggles. Claire, too, began to open up, though slowly. She told James bits and pieces of her life: her childhood in foster care, her marriage to a man who had seemed charming at first but quickly revealed his true nature. She spoke of the nights she'd spent planning her escape, the fear that had gripped her every time she'd thought about leaving. And she spoke of the moment she'd finally decided she couldn't stay, when she looked into Noah and Lily's eyes and realized she had to protect them at all costs. James listened without interrupting, his respect for her growing with each word. She was stronger than she realized, he thought, and her love for her children was nothing short of heroic. But even as Claire shared more of her story, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing. The details she gave about her early life, her mother's death, and her time in foster care stirred a strange sense of familiarity. He didn't mention it to her, not wanting to overwhelm her, but in the quiet hours of the night, he found himself replaying her words, searching for answers. It wasn't until a week later, when he received the results of the investigation he'd quietly initiated, that everything began to fall into place. James sat in his study late at night, the only light coming from a green-shaded desk lamp casting a warm glow over the room. The file from his investigator rested in his hands, the weight of its contents pressing against his chest. As he flipped through the neatly typed pages, each word seemed to deepen the knot in his stomach. The connections were undeniable. Claire's mother, Elizabeth Hayes, was a name he hadn't heard in decades, but one he could never forget. Elizabeth had been his first love, a whirlwind romance from his youth before the pressures of family obligations and business took over his life. She was spirited, kind, and fiercely independent, qualities that had both drawn him to her and ultimately driven them apart when his father disapproved. They had parted ways abruptly, and James had buried the pain of that loss under layers of ambition and responsibility. He had never known Elizabeth was pregnant. The report painted a tragic picture. Elizabeth had kept Claire, raising her alone for several years before succumbing to an illness that left Claire an orphan. The child had been placed into the foster system, bouncing from home to home until she aged out. Her resilience in the face of such instability was nothing short of remarkable, and it explained the guarded, determined woman he now knew. But the realization that she was his daughter, that she had been out there all these years, suffering without his knowledge, left him reeling. James leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he tried to process the revelation. How could he tell her? What would she think of him, knowing he had been absent from her life? He felt a surge of guilt, though he knew logically there had been no way for him to know. Still, it didn't matter. The fact remained that he had failed her, even unknowingly, and now he had to make it right. The next morning, James approached the suite with a mixture of apprehension and determination. He knocked gently, and Claire opened the door, looking more relaxed than when they had first met. The babies were awake, their bright eyes scanning the room from their bassinets. James felt a pang of tenderness as he stepped inside, his gaze briefly meeting Noah's, who gurgled happily in response. "I need to talk to you," James said, his voice steady but tinged with an undercurrent of emotion. "It's important." Claire's brow furrowed, but she nodded, gesturing for him to sit at the small table in the corner of the room. She followed, her movements cautious, as if sensing the weight of what he was about to say. "I've been doing some digging into your past," James began, choosing his words carefully. "I know you didn't ask me to, but I felt it was necessary to fully understand your situation so I could help." Claire's expression shifted to one of guarded curiosity, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What did you find?" James hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he exhaled deeply and met her gaze. "Your mother, Elizabeth Hayes. She and I knew each other. A long time ago. We were close." Claire's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I didn't know she was pregnant," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea she had a child. That you existed." If I had... He stopped himself, the enormity of the missed years hitting him like a freight train. He swallowed hard and pressed on. Claire, I believe I'm your father. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft cooing of Lily from her bassinet. Claire stared at him, her expression unreadable, as if trying to process his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My father, she repeated, as though testing the words. James nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I know this is a lot to take in. Believe me, it's overwhelming for me too. But everything points to it being true. I'm so sorry, Claire. I should have been there for you. Claire leaned back in her chair, her eyes darting to the babies and then back to James. All these years, I didn't even know you existed. My mom never talked about you. She always said she didn't want me to carry the weight of things she couldn't change. James felt a lump form in his throat. Elizabeth's decision made sense in a way, but it didn't ease the ache of knowing what could have been. She was protecting you, he said softly. She always wanted the best for you. Claire's gaze dropped to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. I don't know how to feel about this, she admitted. It's a lot to take in. My whole life, I thought I was alone. And now... She trailed off, and James resisted the urge to reach out, sensing she needed space to process. Take all the time you need, he said gently. I just want you to know I'm here for you now. For you, for Noah, for Lily. Whatever you need. Claire looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Why did you stop that day? Why did you help me? James hesitated, then gave her the truth. I don't know, he admitted. Something about you. It felt familiar. Like I was supposed to stop. Like I couldn't walk away. Claire nodded slowly, her expression softening. Maybe it was meant to happen. James felt a flicker of hope at her words. Maybe it was, he agreed. As the babies stirred, Claire stood and moved to pick up Lily, cradling the child against her chest. She looked back at James, her face still a mixture of confusion and cautious openness. I need time to figure this out, she said. But thank you for telling me. James stood, his heart heavy yet strangely lighter. Take all the time you need, he said again, his voice steady. I'll be here. He left the suite, his mind racing with what lay ahead. This was only the beginning, he knew. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a chance to finally build the family he had never known he'd lost. Over the next few days, Claire kept her distance. She wasn't cold or unkind, but her interactions with James were careful, measured. She had agreed to stay at the hotel, a small step toward trust, but it was clear she was struggling to make sense of the revelation. James didn't push her. He checked in daily, sometimes bringing small gifts for the babies, soft toys, storybooks, or practical items like diapers and formula. Claire always accepted them with a quiet thank you, but her eyes held a flicker of hesitation, as if she feared there might be strings attached. James spent his evenings reflecting on his life, his choices, and the vast expanse of time that had separated him from Claire. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became to make up for what had been lost. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Trust was something earned, not given freely, and Claire had every reason to guard hers closely. But he was patient, willing to wait as long as it took. One evening, he decided to take a different approach. Instead of confronting Claire directly, he reached out to Walter, his longtime driver and confidant. Walter had been a silent witness to much of James's life, including the recent discovery of his daughter. You've been quiet about all this, James said as they sat in his office, sipping coffee. But I can see you've got thoughts. Let's hear them. Walter, a man in his 70s with a calm demeanor and sharp insight, leaned back in his chair. Well, sir, I've known you a long time. Long enough to know when you're trying to fix something by throwing money at it. James frowned but didn't argue. Walter's bluntness was one of the reasons he valued the man's opinion. And you think that's what I'm doing here? Walter shook his head. No, not this time. But I think you're trying to fix this like it's a business problem. Claire's not one of your board members, and those babies aren't some investment. They're people, James. They need more than what your wallet can give them. James let the words sink in. He knew Walter was right. Claire didn't need him to solve her problems with expensive gestures. She needed him to show her that he was there for her in a way that couldn't be bought. "I don't know how to reach her," James admitted. "Every time I try, it feels like I'm pushing her further away." Walter smiled faintly. "Maybe stop trying so hard. Sometimes the best way to show someone you care is just to be there. Let her come to you." The advice stayed with James. The next day, he took a step back, giving Claire space while making it clear he was available if she needed him. He lingered in the hotel lounge instead of his office, worked on his laptop in common areas where she might see him, and made a point to engage with the babies whenever they crossed paths. It was Noah who broke the ice. The little boy, just beginning to toddle, waddled unsteadily into the lounge one afternoon while Claire was distracted with Lily. James looked up from his laptop to see Noah grinning at him, his tiny hands reaching out as if inviting him to play. Without hesitation, James set his work aside and crouched to meet the boy, who giggled and clutched at James's finger with surprising strength. "Well, aren't you bold?" James said, his tone warm. "You're going to give your mother a heart attack, wandering off like that." Claire appeared moments later, her expression a mixture of panic and relief. "Noah, I told you to stay." She stopped short when she saw him with James. "He's quite the adventurer," James said, straightening but keeping his tone light. "You've got your hands full with this one." Claire let out a breath and gave a small laugh, the tension in her shoulders easing. "He's a handful, all right." From that moment, the walls between them began to crack. Claire still kept her guard up, but she started to accept James's presence in their lives. She began joining him for breakfast in the hotel dining room, talking cautiously but more openly. James learned about her struggles in the foster system, the ways she'd had to fight for every scrap of stability, and the dreams she'd put on hold to survive. He listened intently, offering no solutions, only understanding. For Claire, the realization that James wasn't trying to control her or force a relationship was a turning point. She began to see the sincerity in his actions, the way he doted on Noah and Lily, the quiet respect he showed her, and the patience with which he let her set the pace. Slowly, she found herself wanting to trust him, though it scared her to admit it. One evening, after the babies had fallen asleep, Claire joined James on the rooftop terrace of the hotel. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a sea of lights stretching endlessly into the night. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly as the cool breeze swept by. James noticed and immediately shrugged off his jacket, draping it over her shoulders without a word. She glanced at him, surprised by the gesture, but didn't protest. "You don't have to do all this, you know," she said softly. "I'm grateful, but you've already done more than enough." James leaned on the railing, his gaze fixed on the city below. "It's not about doing enough, Claire. It's about being here. For you. For them." He paused, then turned to her. "I miss so much of your life. I can't change that. But I want to be here now, if you'll let me." Claire studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "I'm not used to people sticking around," she admitted. "But I think I want to give this a chance, to see what it could be." James felt a wave of emotion rise within him, but he kept his voice steady. "That's all I could ask for." As they stood there, side by side under the starlit sky, James felt the first glimmers of hope that their fractured past could begin to heal. It was a small step, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The next few weeks brought a quiet but significant shift. Claire seemed lighter, less weighed down by the constant tension that had surrounded her since their first meeting. She began smiling more, laughing even, especially when Noah or Lily did something mischievous. James noticed the change, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he embraced the growing ease between them, careful not to overstep the fragile trust they were building. James found himself increasingly drawn into their world. Noah's toddling became more confident, and James often found himself crouching on the carpet in Claire's suite, catching the boy as he stumbled into his arms. Lily, quieter and more observant, had a habit of staring at him with her wide eyes, as though trying to figure him out. He often caught her watching him, and he would smile and make a silly face just to see her giggle. It wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing, but it felt natural in a way that surprised him. Claire, meanwhile, had started to ask questions about his life. At first, they were small, casual things. Where he had grown up, what his favorite book was. But as time went on, the questions became more personal. She wanted to know about his parents, his marriage, and the reasons behind the choices he had made. James answered honestly, even when the memories were painful. He spoke about his father's strict expectations, the way they had driven him to prioritize success over everything else. He told her about Eleanor, his late wife, and how her loss had left him feeling untethered, adrift. In return, Claire began to share more of her own life. She spoke about her mother, Elizabeth, with a mixture of warmth and sadness. She described her as strong and loving, but also secretive, someone who had carried burdens she never fully explained. Claire admitted that she had always wondered about her father, but had stopped asking questions when she realized how much it hurt her mother. "I used to make up stories about you," she said one evening as they sat in the lounge. "I'd imagine you were some kind of hero, off saving the world, and that's why you couldn't be with us. It was easier to believe that than to think you just didn't want to be there." James's throat tightened, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "If I had known, Claire," he said quietly, "I would have been there. I would have done everything I could." She looked at him, her expression soft but uncertain. "I believe you," she said after a moment, "but it's still hard to reconcile the father I imagined with the man sitting here now." James nodded, understanding her hesitation. "You don't have to figure it all out at once. We have time." Despite the progress they were making, the shadow of Claire's past loomed over them. Her ex-husband had gone silent, but Claire was wary. She knew his silence didn't mean he had given up. It meant he was planning. James had offered to hire private security, but Claire had declined, worried it would draw more attention. Instead, she relied on her own vigilance, always keeping the babies close and avoiding unnecessary outings. One afternoon, as James and Claire were watching the babies play in the hotel suite, a knock at the door interrupted them. Claire stiffened, her body going rigid as she scooped Lily into her arms. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and went to answer the door himself. It was Walter, holding a thick envelope. "This just arrived, sir," he said, his expression grim. James took the envelope and closed the door, his mind racing. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside was a handwritten note, accompanied by a stack of photos. The note was short and chilling. "You can't hide her forever." The photos were of Claire and the babies, taken from a distance. Some were from the street outside the hotel, others from the park where Claire had taken the babies a few days earlier. It was clear that her ex-husband had found her. Claire noticed the change in James's expression and stood, clutching Lily tightly. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated, not wanting to alarm her, but knowing he couldn't keep this from her. He handed her the note and the photos. Her face went pale as she looked at them, her free hand covering her mouth. "He's watching us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James stepped closer, his presence solid and grounding. "We'll handle this," he said firmly. "I'll make sure he can't get near you or the babies." Claire shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't know him, James. He's not going to stop. He doesn't care about laws or restraining orders. He'll find a way." James placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady. "He may not care about the law, but he'll care about what happens if he crosses me. Trust me, Claire. I'll keep you safe." The determination in his voice seemed to steady her, though her fear didn't fully dissipate. She nodded slowly, holding Lily close as Noah toddled over, clutching at her leg. James crouched down, gently lifting the boy into his arms. "You're not alone anymore," he said, looking directly at Claire. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect all of you." That evening, James made several calls. He hired a security team, instructing them to keep a low profile while maintaining constant surveillance. He also contacted his legal team, ensuring that everything was in place to take swift action if her ex-husband attempted anything. As night fell, James sat in his study, his thoughts heavy. He had spent much of his life solving problems with money and power, but this was different. This wasn't just about strategy or influence. It was about protecting the people he cared about. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a drive not rooted in business, but in something far more personal. The stakes were high, and the danger was real, but James was resolute. He had spent too much of his life letting important things slip through his fingers. This time, he wouldn't fail. The days that followed were tense, but carefully managed. James's newly hired security team worked discreetly, blending into the hotel staff and surrounding the building in quiet vigilance. Claire stayed mostly in the suite, her outings with the babies limited to the rooftop garden or the private lounge. Though she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Noah and Lily, James could see the strain in her every movement, the way her eyes darted to every corner, the way she jumped at the sound of footsteps in the hall. James did everything he could to reassure her. He spent more time with her and the babies, even canceling meetings and delegating tasks he would have normally handled himself. Sitting cross-legged on the carpet, building block towers for Noah to gleefully knock over, or reading picture books to Lily while she sat snug in Claire's lap, James began to feel something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. This wasn't the life he'd planned, but in many ways, it felt more real and fulfilling than anything he'd ever achieved. One evening, as the sun set and the golden light filtered through the large windows of the suite, Claire sat by the bassinet, watching her babies drift off to sleep. James was on the couch, absently flipping through a book but stealing glances at her. There was a quiet beauty in the way she cradled Lily's hand, humming softly until the baby's eyes fluttered closed. "You're good at this," he said after a moment, his voice low so as not to disturb the peaceful scene. Claire looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and modesty. "At what?" "At being their mother," James said, setting the book aside. "They're lucky to have you." She smiled faintly, though there was a shadow of doubt in her eyes. "I don't always feel like I know what I'm doing. Half the time, I'm just hoping I'm making the right choices." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's all anyone can do. Eleanor and I." He paused, catching himself. He rarely spoke about his late wife, but something about the moment felt right. "We always thought we'd have children. We planned for it. But life had other ideas. She would have been an incredible mother." Claire studied him, her head tilting slightly. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," James admitted. "But it's not just her I miss. It's the life we were supposed to have. The family we never got to build." He paused, his gaze shifting to Noah and Lily. "That's why this matters to me, Claire. Being here for you. For them, it's a second chance." Claire looked away, her fingers tracing patterns on the edge of the bassinet. "I've spent most of my life thinking I didn't matter to anyone, that I was just invisible. It's hard to believe I'm not, even now." James rose and moved to sit in the chair beside her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're not invisible, Claire. You never were. And you matter more than you know. To me, to them, to everyone who's lucky enough to know you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, giving him a small nod. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying that." The moment hung between them, fragile and unspoken, but deeply significant. For the first time, Claire felt the possibility of being truly seen, not just as a struggling mother or a woman on the run, but as someone worthy of care and connection. The calm, however, was short-lived. The following morning, James received an urgent call from his head of security. Her ex-husband, Eric, had been spotted near the hotel. Though he hadn't made any direct move, the team had caught him loitering across the street, watching the entrance. James's initial reaction was fury, but he quickly tamped it down, knowing he needed to stay level-headed. He went to Claire immediately, finding her pacing the suite with Lily in her arms, while Noah played with a set of blocks on the floor. "Claire," he said, his voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." She froze, turning to him with wide eyes. "What's wrong?" James gestured for her to sit, his expression serious but calm. Once she was seated, he explained the situation. Eric was spotted near the hotel. "He hasn't tried anything yet, but he's watching." Claire's face paled, and she clutched Lily closer. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. James nodded, moving to sit across from her. "He's not getting near you or the babies, Claire. I've already taken steps to make sure of that. The security team is on high alert, and I've instructed them to be prepared for anything. Her hands shook as she adjusted Lily's blanket. I knew he wouldn't give up. He's always been like this, obsessed with control, with making me afraid. James leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers. He doesn't control you anymore, and he's not going to scare you into running. You're not alone in this, Claire. We're going to handle it together. She hesitated, her fear evident, but something in James's tone seemed to reach her. She nodded slowly, her grip on Lily loosening just slightly. What do we do now? We stay calm, James said. We let the team do their job, and if he tries anything, we'll make sure he's held accountable. Claire took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to Noah, who had paused his playing to look up at her. She managed a shaky smile, bending down to stroke his hair. Okay, she said softly, but I'm not letting my guard down. James nodded, respecting her resolve. Neither am I. As the day wore on, the tension in the suite was palpable, but James made a point of staying close. He played with Noah, read stories to Lily, and kept Claire company, sensing that his presence offered her some measure of comfort. The security team updated him periodically, assuring him that Eric hadn't made any further moves, but James remained vigilant. That night, as the city settled into its usual hum of activity, James found himself looking out the suite's large windows, the lights of Manhattan stretching endlessly into the horizon. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Claire or the babies. This was his family now, and he would protect them with everything he had. The night passed slowly, every sound amplified in the quiet suite. Claire barely slept, her thoughts racing with memories of Eric and the terror he had brought into her life. Every creak of the hotel's walls, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent a shiver through her. James stayed awake as well, sitting in the armchair by the window, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the city outside. He kept his phone within reach, ready for any updates from the security team. By morning, the hotel staff reported that Eric hadn't been seen again, but Claire's unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting, biding his time for the perfect moment to strike. James, sensing her anxiety, suggested a change of scenery. We can't live like this, he said over breakfast, his tone gentle but firm. The suite is comfortable, but it's starting to feel like a cage. Let's take the babies to the rooftop garden. It's secure, and the fresh air might do us all some good. Claire hesitated, glancing toward the windows as though Eric might be lurking just beyond them. But when she looked at Noah and Lily, both restless after days confined indoors, she realized James was right. They needed the sunshine, even if only for a little while. The rooftop garden was a sanctuary amid the chaos of the city. Surrounded by tall hedges and vibrant flowers, it offered a rare sense of peace. Noah immediately toddled off toward a patch of grass, giggling as he tried to chase a butterfly. James followed close behind, his smile wide as he guided the boy away from the edge of a fountain. Claire stayed back with Lily, sitting on a bench in the shade and watching as James and Noah explored. It was the first time in days that she felt a semblance of calm. The sight of James with Noah stirred something in her, an unfamiliar but welcome sense of safety. He wasn't just protecting them. He was becoming part of their lives in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to have a father, not just for her but for Noah and Lily as well. James seemed to sense her watching him. He turned, lifting Noah into the air, making the boy squeal with delight. You should come over here, he called, his voice light. Noah's convinced he can catch that butterfly. He might need some help. Claire smiled despite herself. She rose from the bench, cradling Lily as she joined them. The sun felt warm on her face, and for a brief moment, she let herself believe they could have this. Peace, joy, a sense of normalcy. That afternoon, as the babies napped back in the suite, Claire sat with James in the lounge. She hadn't planned to open up, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. I never thought I'd feel safe again, she said quietly, staring at her hands. Not after everything Eric did. James leaned forward, his expression serious. You don't have to be afraid anymore. He doesn't have the power he used to. Claire shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. It's not just about him. It's about me. The way he made me doubt myself, made me feel like I wasn't strong enough to leave, to protect my kids. Even now, I wonder if I can really keep them safe. James reached across the table, his hand covering hers. You've already done more than most people would. You got them out. You took that first step, and that's the hardest part. The rest, you don't have to do it alone. His words settled over her like a balm, soothing some of the raw edges that fear and guilt had left behind. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. James gave her hand a gentle squeeze. You don't have to thank me, Claire. We're family. That's what family does. The word family hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Claire wasn't sure she was ready to fully accept it, but she couldn't deny the truth in his statement. James was more than a protector or a benefactor. He was her father, and whether she liked it or not, that meant something. Later that evening, as James stepped out for a call with his legal team, Claire found herself alone with her thoughts. She glanced at the bassinet where Noah and Lily slept, their soft breaths filling the room with a soothing rhythm. She thought about the life she had fled, the fear that had followed her, and the unexpected hope that had begun to take root since meeting James. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. For a split second, her heart leapt into her throat, but then she heard the familiar voice of Walter, James's driver. Miss Claire? It's Walter. May I come in? She opened the door cautiously, relief washing over her when she saw the older man's kind face. Is everything all right? Walter nodded, stepping inside with a small package in his hands. I thought you might like this, he said, handing it to her. Mr. Whitmore mentioned you've been nervous. I figured a little something to keep your hands busy might help. Curious, Claire opened the package to find a set of art supplies, sketchbooks, pencils, and watercolors. She was stunned. How did you know I like to draw? Walter smiled. James told me you mentioned it in passing. Said it was something you used to do but hadn't had time for lately. He thought it might help you feel more like yourself again. Tears pricked her eyes as she ran her fingers over the smooth cover of the sketchbook. It had been years since she'd allowed herself the luxury of creating, and the thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This means more than you know. Walter tipped his hat, his smile warm. You're welcome, Miss Claire. And remember, you're not alone. You've got people looking out for you now. As he left, Claire sat at the table, opening the sketchbook and picking up a pencil. She hesitated for a moment, then began to draw. The lines came slowly at first, tentative, but as she let herself sink into the familiar rhythm, her movements grew more confident. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of the person she used to be. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild the life Eric had tried to take from her. The next morning, Claire woke to the soft coos of Lily and the rhythmic babbling of Noah. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel a weight crushing her chest as she opened her eyes. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Safe. James had already stopped by with coffee and fresh croissants from the hotel's kitchen, a gesture Claire was beginning to expect and appreciate. He didn't linger this time, excusing himself with a promise to return later in the day. She could tell he was giving her space, which only made her more grateful for his presence. He had become a steady anchor in her life, something she hadn't realized she needed until it was there. After feeding the babies and getting them settled for their morning naps, Claire pulled out the sketchbook Walter had brought the previous night. She sat at the small table by the window, the sounds of the city below muffled by the glass. Her pencil moved almost of its own accord, the lines flowing easily now, as though her hands had been waiting for this release. She sketched Lily first, capturing the soft curve of her tiny face and the gentle sweep of her lashes. Then she moved to Noah, his bright, curious eyes practically leaping off the page. As she worked, she felt something unfamiliar bubbling to the surface. Joy. It was small, quiet, and fragile, but it was there, a reminder of who she was before fear had taken over her life. Her peaceful moment was interrupted by the buzz of her phone. The sound sent a jolt through her, but when she picked it up and saw James's name, her pulse slowed. She answered quickly. "Claire," he said, his tone calm but laced with urgency, "I just got a call from the security team. Eric's been spotted again, closer this time." Her heart sank, the momentary peace shattered. "What do we do?" "I've already made arrangements," James replied. "We're moving you and the babies to a safer location." "Moving us?" she asked, her voice catching. The thought of uprooting herself again, even temporarily, felt overwhelming. "It's just for a short time," James reassured her. "The security team has a property in the countryside, isolated, secure, and fully staffed. You'll have everything you need, and it'll give us time to deal with Eric properly." Claire hesitated, looking toward the bassinet where Noah and Lily slept peacefully. The idea of leaving the comfort of the hotel, the small routine they'd established, filled her with anxiety. But the thought of staying and risking Eric getting any closer was far worse. "Okay," she said softly. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," James said. "I'll be with you the whole time. Just pack what you need for the babies, and the rest will be handled." That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Claire found herself in the back seat of a black SUV with James beside her. The babies were safely secured in car seats, their small faces calm and unbothered by the tension in the air. The convoy of vehicles moved quickly through the city, leaving behind the bright lights and noise of Manhattan as they headed toward the quiet countryside. The drive was long but uneventful. By the time they arrived at the estate, the stars were out, scattered across the inky sky. The property was vast and secluded, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The house itself was a sprawling, modern structure, all clean lines and large windows that reflected the moonlight. Inside, the space was warm and welcoming. A team of staff greeted them, quickly helping to unload the bags and settle Claire and the babies into a cozy suite on the second floor. The nursery was already stocked with everything they could possibly need, from cribs to toys to an array of baby clothes. As Claire looked around, she felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. She had spent so long doing everything on her own, scraping by with the bare minimum, that the sheer abundance of comfort and care felt almost overwhelming. "This is a lot," she said to James as he joined her in the nursery. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression soft. "You deserve it," he said simply. "And so do they." She didn't argue, though she still felt uneasy about accepting so much. Instead, she focused on settling the babies into their new cribs, tucking them in under soft, plush blankets. Noah stirred briefly, his tiny hand reaching for hers, and she pressed a kiss to his forehead before stepping back. That night, as she lay in the large bed of her suite, the quiet of the countryside pressed around her like a blanket. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside the window, the occasional chirp of crickets. It was so different from the constant hum of the city that it took her a while to relax, her body still tense from weeks of vigilance. But eventually, the exhaustion caught up with her, and she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Claire woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of laughter. She followed the noise downstairs to find James in the kitchen with Noah on his hip, the little boy giggling as James made exaggerated faces at him. Lily was in her bouncy chair nearby, kicking her tiny legs as one of the staff cooed at her. "Good morning," James said as he spotted her, his smile wide. "Noah's been helping me make breakfast." Claire couldn't help but smile at the sight. "Looks like he's enjoying himself." "He's a natural," James said, bouncing the boy slightly, which earned another round of delighted giggles. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to build something real here, something stable. She wasn't ready to let her guard down completely, but as she watched James with Noah, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't dared to feel in years: trust. The days at the countryside estate unfolded with a surprising ease. The property was a safe haven, a world away from the tension and fear that had dominated Claire's life in the city. The sprawling grounds gave her and the babies space to breathe, to relax, to begin feeling something closer to normal. James was a constant presence, quietly integrating himself into their daily routine without intruding. He had a way of making himself useful without being overbearing, and Claire found herself leaning on him in ways she hadn't anticipated. Noah took to the open space with unrestrained enthusiasm. He toddled through the grass, chasing butterflies and picking wildflowers with the delighted curiosity only a child could muster. James was never far behind, keeping a watchful eye on the boy as he explored. Lily, still too young to roam, enjoyed being carried along, her wide eyes soaking in every detail of the world around her. Claire often joined them on their walks through the estate, a sketchbook tucked under her arm. She found herself drawing more often now, the peaceful surroundings awakening a creative spark she thought she'd lost forever. She sketched everything. The trees swaying gently in the breeze, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the way Noah's tiny hands clutched at the grass. But most often, she sketched James. The way he crouched down to Noah's level, his face soft with affection. The way he carried Lily, his large hands cradling her with such tenderness that it brought a lump to Claire's throat. One evening, after the babies had been put to bed, Claire found herself sitting on the back porch with James. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and the cicadas hummed softly in the background. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that only grew from time spent building trust. "Do you ever miss it?" Claire asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "The life you had before. All of this?" James tilted his head, considering her question. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There's a part of me that misses the simplicity of it. Work was all I knew. It was safe, predictable. But," he paused, his gaze shifting to the horizon, "it was also empty. I didn't realize how much I was missing until I found you." "Found them?" Claire looked at him, her heart tightening at the sincerity in his voice. "I never expected any of this," she said softly. "I didn't even know how to hope for something like this." James turned to her, his expression gentle. "You don't have to hope for it anymore. It's real. It's yours." For a moment, Claire felt the overwhelming urge to tell him everything, to share every fear, every doubt, every piece of herself she'd kept hidden for so long. But the words caught in her throat, tangled up in the remnants of the walls she'd built around herself. Instead, she simply nodded, letting the weight of his words settle over her. The peace they'd found was fragile, but for a time, it held. The security team remained vigilant, patrolling the estate and keeping tabs on Eric's movements. He hadn't made another appearance near the hotel or the estate, but they all knew his silence wasn't a guarantee of safety. Claire tried not to think about him, but the knowledge of his presence lingered like a shadow at the edges of her mind. One afternoon, as Claire sat sketching on the porch while Noah played nearby, James approached with a hesitant smile. He held something behind his back, and Claire raised an eyebrow in curiosity. "What are you hiding?" she asked, setting her pencil down. James revealed a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A gift," he said, handing it to her. "I saw it and thought of you." Claire took the package carefully, unwrapping it to reveal a beautifully bound journal with an embossed leather cover. She ran her fingers over the intricate design, her chest tightening with emotion. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you might like a place to write," James said. "Or draw, if you want. Something just for you." Claire looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said, the words thick with meaning. She spent the next hour filling the first page of the journal, her pencil moving in fluid strokes as she captured the scene around her. When she finished, she looked down at the drawing. A sketch of Noah chasing a butterfly, James standing in the background with Lily cradled in his arms. It was simple but full of life, a snapshot of the fragile happiness they'd found. That evening, as she tucked the babies into bed, Claire felt a quiet resolve settle over her. She couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for Eric to strike. She needed to reclaim her life, not just for herself but for Noah and Lily. And she realized she didn't have to do it alone. The next morning, she approached James in the study, her sketchbook in one hand and the journal in the other. He looked up from his laptop, his expression softening as he saw her. "I want to talk," she said, her voice steady. "About everything. About Eric, about the future. I don't want to run anymore." James closed the laptop and gestured for her to sit. "I'm listening." For the first time, Claire laid everything bare. She told him about the years of control and manipulation, the fear that had kept her trapped, and the strength it had taken to leave. She spoke about her dreams for Noah and Lily, her hope that they could grow up in a world where they felt safe and loved. And she spoke about her own fears, her struggles to trust, and the way James had begun to chip away at the walls she'd built. When she finished, James reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. "You're stronger than you realize, Claire, and you don't have to face any of this alone. Whatever it takes, we'll get through it together." For the first time, Claire believed him. She wasn't just running anymore. She was ready to fight for the life she and her children deserved. And she knew, with James by her side, they had a chance. A real chance. The following days were filled with preparation and quiet determination. Claire's decision to stop running infused the entire household with a sense of purpose. The security team worked to tighten the estate's defenses, while James consulted with his legal advisors and private investigators to build a comprehensive case against Eric. Every detail was scrutinized, every possible angle considered. James was methodical, his calm confidence steadying Claire in ways she hadn't realized she needed. Claire, in turn, found herself stepping into a new role, one of strength and action. She spent hours with James and the team, providing details of her life with Eric that might help build their case. It was painful, dredging up memories she had worked so hard to bury, but she was resolute. Every piece of information was another step toward freedom, another brick removed from the walls Eric had built around her life. One afternoon, James and Claire sat together in the study, reviewing documents spread across the large mahogany desk. Noah and Lily were playing on the carpet nearby, their laughter a welcome contrast to the seriousness of the work. "You're doing incredibly well," James said, glancing at Claire as she finished signing a document. "This isn't easy, but you're handling it with so much strength." Claire looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It doesn't feel like strength most of the time. It feels like I'm barely holding it together." "That's what strength is," James said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not about feeling unshakable. It's about facing the fear and doing what needs to be done anyway." His words stayed with her, grounding her when doubt crept in. She found herself drawing on his calm confidence, letting it bolster her when her resolve faltered. Slowly, she began to see herself the way he did, as someone capable, resilient, and brave. Then, just as they began to believe they might be nearing the end of this chapter, Eric made his move. It was late in the evening, the house quiet as the babies slept and the staff retired to their quarters. Claire had just finished reading a book in her room when the sound of raised voices reached her ears. She froze, her heart pounding as she strained to make out the words. Moments later, James appeared in her doorway, his face grim. "He's here," James said, his voice calm but urgent. "Security caught him trying to get onto the property. He didn't make it far, but I need you to stay here with the babies. The team is handling it." Claire's stomach churned with a mixture of fear and anger. "What's he trying to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What does he want?" "Control," James said simply. "It's all he's ever wanted. But he's not getting it this time." James left the room, his steps measured and deliberate as he joined the security team. Claire stayed behind, pacing the nursery as she checked on Noah and Lily. Both babies were sound asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their safe haven. She wrapped her arms around herself, willing her racing heart to slow as she listened for any sign of trouble. The confrontation outside was swift but intense. Eric, furious and desperate, shouted threats as the security team detained him. James watched from a distance, his expression a mask of calm as he listened to the man's venomous words. He didn't respond, refusing to give Eric the satisfaction of engaging. Instead, he made a single phone call, instructing the local authorities to come and take Eric into custody. When the police arrived, James handed over the evidence he and Claire had worked so hard to compile. The restraining order violations, the harassment, the threats, it was all there, meticulously documented. The officers reviewed the files, nodding grimly as they placed Eric in handcuffs. He resisted, spewing accusations and insults, but it was clear he had no real power left. As the police car disappeared down the long driveway, James exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He stayed outside for a moment, letting the cool night air settle over him, before heading back inside to find Claire. She was still in the nursery, her arms wrapped protectively around Lily as she rocked in the chair. Noah was awake now, sitting in his crib and babbling softly. When James entered, Claire looked up, her eyes filled with questions. "It's over," James said, his voice soft but firm. "The police have him. He won't be coming back." Claire let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. "It feels too good to be true," she said quietly. "Like he's still out there, waiting." "He's not," James assured her. "You're safe, Claire. You and the babies. He can't hurt you anymore." For the first time in what felt like years, Claire allowed herself to believe it. The weight that had pressed on her chest for so long began to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. She set Lily down in her crib and turned to James, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "For everything. For standing by me. For believing in me." James stepped closer, his expression warm and steady. "You don't have to thank me, Claire. You're my family, and I'll always be here for you." The words settled over her like a promise, solid and unwavering. She took a deep breath, letting the reality of their new beginning sink in. For the first time in years, she felt free, not just from Eric, but from the fear and doubt that had held her back for so long. The days that followed were filled with quiet celebration. Claire, James, Noah, and Lily began to build a life together, one rooted in trust, love, and the shared understanding that they had faced the worst and come out stronger. There were challenges ahead, of course. Healing wasn't a straight path, but they faced them together as a family. And as Claire sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the countryside with Noah and Lily playing at her feet, she allowed herself to dream of the future. For the first time, it didn't feel like an impossible fantasy. It felt real, tangible, and within reach. With James by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. Together, they had found not just safety, but a new beginning. A life worth fighting for. A life filled with hope.